A young cop looked at an elderly man in a worn coat and snarled, "Wait outside." Minutes later, he discovered he'd just humiliated the very judge who had run that courthouse for 20 years, and his badge would never feel the same again. Rain fell in thin grey lines as an elderly man climbed the courthouse steps with a worn leather briefcase in his hand. Before he could reach the doors, a young police officer stepped in front of him and stretched out an arm. "Wait outside, old man. Court employees only." The words were loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Conversation stopped. A woman carrying legal files glanced up. Two reporters standing by the entrance exchanged uncomfortable looks. The old man blinked once. "I have an appointment inside," he said calmly. The officer smirked. "And I have a badge, so step back." A few people chuckled nervously. Others simply stared. The old man did not argue. He looked toward the towering courthouse columns, then back at the officer. "I see," he replied quietly. There was something strange about his composure. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't angry. It almost seemed as though he was studying the building, memorizing details he already knew. The officer folded his arms proudly. To him, this was just another confused senior citizen, trying to wander somewhere he didn't belong. But nobody standing on those courthouse steps knew the truth. Nobody knew who the elderly man was. And nobody had any idea that the person they had just ordered to wait outside once held more authority inside that building than anyone still working there. Within minutes, black cars would begin arriving, powerful people would rush toward the entrance, and one careless sentence would threaten an entire career forever. The elderly man standing in the rain was not a lost visitor or a confused retiree. For 20 years, he had served as the courthouse's chief judge. Thousands of cases had passed through his courtroom. Young attorneys had built careers under his guidance, and generations of judges still quoted his opinions. Yet almost nobody outside legal circles recognized him anymore. He preferred it that way. After retirement, he moved into a small house, drove an old car, and spent most of his days reading, volunteering, and visiting his grandchildren. He never introduced himself by his former title. He believed respect earned through service meant more than recognition demanded through status. That morning, he had returned to the courthouse for a ceremony honoring the building's history and the people who had shaped it. He had received a formal invitation weeks earlier. He had considered declining the invitation, but a former colleague insisted that the courthouse would not feel complete without him there. Meanwhile, the young officer guarding the entrance stood a few feet away, feeling proud of himself. He considered himself sharp, disciplined, and impossible to fool. In his mind, experience had taught him one simple rule: appearances told the truth. A well-dressed person belonged inside. A poorly dressed person did not. One of the courthouse clerks approached him quietly. "Shouldn't we at least check his name?" she asked. The officer laughed under his breath. "Look at him," he said. "Does he look like someone expected at a courthouse event?" The clerk glanced toward the elderly man, who remained standing near the steps with his briefcase resting at his side. "I'm just saying we don't know who he is." "I do," the officer replied confidently. "He's someone who needs to wait outside." Nearby visitors had begun whispering. Some looked uncomfortable. Others assumed the officer must know what he was doing. The old man heard every word, yet his expression never changed. He simply stood there, calm and patient. The rain continued falling around him, collecting on the shoulders of his old coat. Every now and then he looked toward the courthouse entrance with a quiet, almost familiar smile. Then, without warning, a black sedan turned the corner and slowly pulled to the curb. Within seconds, every conversation stopped. What happened when its passengers stepped out would completely change the atmosphere outside the courthouse. The black sedan came to a stop at the curb, followed immediately by another vehicle behind it. The doors opened, and several distinguished men and women stepped out carrying folders and umbrellas. They were senior judges, respected attorneys, and courthouse administrators. Then they saw the elderly man. Their expressions changed instantly. One gray-haired judge hurried across the sidewalk with a smile that seemed to erase 20 years from his face. He reached the old man and shook his hand with both of his own. "Judge, it's wonderful to see you again." Another official followed close behind and embraced him warmly. "Judge, we've been waiting for you." Silence spread across the courthouse steps. The young officer felt his stomach tighten. The clerk beside him, from the visitors to the elderly man, and then back again. Her eyes widened around them. Whispers began moving through the crowd. "Did he say judge? Wait a second. Is that the former chief judge?" Several people reached for their phones. A reporter quietly started recording. The officer suddenly remembered the man's calm voice, his patient smile, and the way he had looked at the courthouse as though he knew it by heart. A courthouse administrator approached, still smiling. "We're honored that you came," she said. Then she paused. "But why are you standing out here in the rain?" The old man looked toward the officer. For a brief moment, nobody breathed. "He asked me to wait outside." The retired judge replied gently. The administrator stared at him. "He what?" The officer stepped forward quickly. "Ma'am, I didn't realize." The administrator looked horrified. "You didn't realize?" She repeated. More judges had gathered by then. Their expressions shifted from confusion to disbelief. The officer's face turned red. "I thought he was just someone trying to enter the building," he said. "I was only doing my job." Nobody answered. The retired judge kept his hand resting on his old briefcase. There was no anger in his face. No bitterness. No desire to humiliate anyone. He simply looked at the young officer and spoke with surprising kindness. Perhaps he made an assumption. Those words somehow made the silence even heavier. The officer lowered his eyes. He had expected outrage. Instead, he was receiving grace. For a moment, it seemed the retired judge intended to forgive the entire incident and walk inside as though nothing had happened. Several people relaxed. A sense of relief moved through the crowd as several spectators put away their phones, convinced that the awkward encounter was ending and that everyone would simply proceed inside together. Then a voice came from the edge of the crowd. "Actually, this isn't the first time." Every head turned. A middle-aged woman stepped forward, clutching a stack of documents against her chest. The expression on her face suggested that she had been waiting a long time to speak. And what she said next would change everything. The middle-aged woman stepped forward slowly. "I work here," she said, "and this isn't the first time." The officer looked at her in disbelief. She took a breath and continued. "I've seen elderly visitors left standing outside because they looked confused. I've seen people in work clothes questioned while others walked right in. There have been complaints." Another employee nodded. "So have I." A security supervisor suddenly appeared at the entrance carrying a folder. "There are reports," he said quietly, "and witness statements." The crowd began murmuring again. The young officer's confidence started slipping away. A few moments earlier, he had believed this was an unfortunate misunderstanding. Now he realized everyone around him was looking at him differently. The administrator opened the folder and glanced at several pages. Her expression hardened. "These complaints go back months." The officer swallowed. "I never meant to offend anyone," he said. "I was trying to protect the courthouse." No one answered. The retired chief judge finally spoke. "Protection is important," he said softly, "but justice begins with respect." Every sound around the courthouse seemed to disappear. The old judge looked at the entrance behind him. "For 20 years, I worked in this building. I wanted every person who walked through those doors to feel that they mattered. Rich or poor, young or old, well-dressed or wearing work boots. Every citizen deserves dignity before a single word is spoken." The surrounding crowd became completely silent. The officer stared at him. For the first time, he truly understood who was standing before him. This was the man who had spent decades shaping the very institution he represented. The man whose values had guided generations of legal professionals, and he had ordered him to wait outside like he didn't belong. The realization struck with crushing force. The young officer's face turned pale. Several employees lowered their eyes. An elderly visitor wiped away tears. A young law student looked at the retired judge and suddenly understood that dignity was not an abstract legal principle, But the foundation of justice. The retired judge continued. A badge gives authority, he said. But authority without humility eventually becomes abuse. The words landed like a verdict. The administrator closed the folder. This matter will be reviewed immediately, she announced. Every complaint, every report. And today's incident. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Rainwater dripped from the courthouse steps as the officer stood frozen in place. He seemed smaller somehow, as though the weight of his own choices had suddenly become visible. Then the old judge turned toward him. His expression was calm, almost fatherly, and when he opened his mouth again, everyone instinctively held their breath. The old judge looked at the young officer for a long moment. Then he said, "I hope you learned from this. Nothing more. No anger, no demand for punishment, no speech about revenge." The simplicity of those words seemed to affect the officer other than any accusation could have done by that afternoon. The courthouse administration announced that the officer had been suspended pending a full disciplinary review. Depending on the findings, he could lose his badge altogether. Many people expected the retired judge to feel vindicated. Some even believed he deserved an apology delivered in front of cameras. Instead, he looked saddened. "I never wanted anyone humiliated," he said quietly. "I only wanted people to be treated with dignity." He glanced toward the courthouse doors. "When I first entered this building decades ago, I was a young lawyer carrying a worn briefcase. I hoped that every person who came here would be respected. That's what justice should feel like." Several employees lowered their heads. One clerk wiped tears from her eyes. The officer stepped forward slowly. "I was wrong," he said. "I judged you before I knew anything about you. And I'm sorry." The old judge nodded. "I accept your apology," he replied. "But remember something important. Respect cannot depend on a person's clothes, age, accent, job, or social status. The moment we decide who deserves dignity and who doesn't, we fail the very people we are meant to serve." No one spoke. The words settled over the courthouse steps like a final lesson. Within hours, recordings of the incident spread online. Millions watched clips of the elderly man standing patiently in the rain and listened to his message about respect and public service. Thousands praised his grace. Community leaders called it a reminder that public institutions belong to everyone. Immigrant families, retirees, laborers, and young students filled comment sections with stories of times they had been judged by appearances alone. Teachers shared the story with students. Lawyers discussed it in offices. People from every background saw themselves in the old man who had quietly refused to answer arrogance with bitterness. Weeks later, the courthouse introduced new customer service and respect training for all personnel. The retired judge never mentioned the incident again. Because sometimes the most important people in the room are the ones who never demand recognition. And the true measure of authority is not how loudly you command others, but how respectfully you treat those who seem powerless.